Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Fusion 360 Live. My name is Brad Tallis. I'm from Autodesk, and today's topic we're going to be learning how to create this control arm for manufacturing. And you'll notice it's actually a two-sided control arm. And so this is a two-part series. This is part one, where I'm going to go through and show how would you go about modeling this control arm. And in part two next week, my buddy Angelo, he's going to be showing how you would actually manufacture this. So Angelo is actually helping me out today. He's on the questions, so if you have any questions, feel free to post them out there. Really knowledgeable on CAM. We make a good team. We're kind of like the three amigos, but there's only two of us. So anyways, Angelo, thank you for helping out. Angelo also designed this part originally for showing off the power of some of the CNC machines, like the Haas machine. I think he showed this at the SEMA event, FabTech, PRI. So this is a pretty cool part, especially because it's not as simple as it looks, and it's going to actually require two different setups to actually manufacture this part, and Angelo is going to be showing that next week. So please make sure you tune in for next week's live stream also. So what I'm going to do is go through and kind of show how would you model this part up. I have a drawing of this, and this drawing is attached to this live stream in the description. So feel free to download it and give this a try on your own. I know it looks fairly complicated, but we're going to kind of walk through step by step. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to start a new design. And I know we're probably going to get flack for this, but we do. This one is in inches. We'll try and do the next one in millimeters, I promise. So I'm going to verify that I'm in inches, which sure enough I am. And I am going to be jumping back and forth between the drawing and the model, just so I'll kind of highlight some of the key dimensions that I'm going to be using. Some of the first things I'm going to point out is you'll notice that the circular areas are not in line with each other. Like I said, this is not as simple as some of the other designs that we've done in the past. We also have this little step down, or whatever you want to call it. We've got some detail views here to kind of detail some of the added extra material. We've got some pockets that exist on both sides. And as we're going through, I'm actually going to purposely make a mistake, because we like to show what happens in the real world and how would we go about fixing that mistake. So you'll see that as we go through. Okay, so one of the first things that I like to do is I'm going to create this as a component. So I'm going to go ahead and say new component, and let's just call this control arm. I'll say okay, and we can see I now have a new component called control arm. The second thing I like to do is I like to go ahead and save it into my project even before I've done anything. That way it kicks in the autosave functionality for me. So I'm going to just call this like control arm LiveStream or something like that. And so now my autosave is going to happen. So if something goes wrong or whatever, I haven't lost a lot of work. So a couple little tips right there. I just looked over the chat. I saw somebody said video resolution is not great. We've actually experienced this before. If you go into your YouTube window, down in the corner, there's a little gear icon. You can click on that and force it to be a higher resolution. So it might just be the streaming quality that you have right now. You can up that up. So go ahead and give that a try and see if that helps. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so I've created a new component, and looking at the drawing, I like to kind of figure out which view has the most information for me. And obviously in this case is what I would call the top view. So this kind of being my front view, top view, and side view. And we can kind of see how it's going to be manufactured is probably, mostly from the top, right? So I'm going to go ahead and start with my top view, and draw the most obvious geometry, which happens to be, the circle on the left and the circle on the right. Now, you've probably heard me say in previous live streams, I like to keep my sketches simple. And we're going to do that in this case here also. I'm going to, generate a couple different sketches and kind of break it down into smaller chunks, almost like how we might be manufacturing this. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and jump over here. So I'm going to draw these two circles. And again, I'm just grabbing the information from the drawing. So I'm not going to jump back every single time to show every single dimension, but I'm going to go ahead and pick on my top view for my sketch. And then let's just create the circle command. And I'm going to go ahead and snap to this 0, 0 point right here. So you'll notice it's not snapping to my grid. But I'm just going to go ahead and get near there, and it does snap to that location. So I'll type in the dimension for the diameter of that circle is 1.033. And here's a tip. I think I've shown this in previous live streams, but if I right mouse click, you'll notice this blue radar looking kind of a thing. This is what we call our marking menu. And you'll notice at 12 o'clock, it says repeat the last command, which in this case was the center diameter circle. And you'll notice this little black line that's kind of moving around. This is what we call a gesture. So I'm not in any command, but if I right click and drag straight up, notice it repeated the circle command. It's kind of a quick way, instead of having to go into the menu and looking for the command or typing in C for circle or anything like that, you can just right mouse click and drag straight up. Now, taking it to the next level, watch what happens when I go to 6 o'clock. It says sketch, and then you can see we've got circle, line, offset, etc., rectangle. So you could even do some funky stuff like drag down and to the right, and you'll get your rectangle command. Drag down and to the left, you'll get your circle command. Drag straight down, you get your line command. So again, a little bit more advanced, but it really helps speed up your design process. Okay, so I've kind of drawn the left side. Now I'm going to draw the right side. And again, I'm not worrying too much about dimensions right now. I'm more worried about the size of these circles. So I'm just going to kind of guesstimate where they need to go. And over here, I'm going to do a 2 diameter circle, repeat my last command. I'll do a 1.6, repeat my last command, and then finally I might do a 1.1. And again, I'm just grabbing those dimensions from the drawing. So there's the 2, the 1.6, and the 1.1. Now I'm actually adding in some extra geometry here. This 1.6 I really don't need right now, but since I'm kind of dealing with the circles, I'm including that with my circles right now, and you'll see why here in just a moment. Okay, now I need to position these where they need to go. You'll notice that these are black lines, so that means that they're constrained to the 0, 0 point, but these are blue, which means that they're not fully constrained yet. So if I throw a dimension on here, I'll come over here, place my dimension, and according to the drawing, it's supposed to be 6.325, and you can see how it updated and moved that over. Now I need to position where it is up and down. So I'm going to click these 2 points. Now here's another tip for you. You'll notice it's trying to do a horizontal dimension. If I move like this, it kind of does an aligned dimension, but I need to do a vertical dimension. I want to specify how far from this red line down is it supposed to be. Well, if I right mouse click, you'll notice I get the option for aligned, vertical, or horizontal. Now in this case, I'm going to say vertical, and it forces it into a vertical dimension now. So I could go ahead and place it, and according to the drawing, it's supposed to be 0.165, and watch what happens. You'll notice that those circles move up, and they are now black lines, so that means that they are constrained. Okay. Taking a look at the drawing, I've basically created, and I apologize for the flashiness, I'm trying to point things out, but I've created these circles over here, I've created the circles on the left. Now I kind of want to start building the body of this control arm. And I notice I've got a line that comes down from the center line, 0.302, and then I've got a line that's at a 6-degree angle. And you'll notice I'm referencing it off of an imaginary point out here in space. So this is kind of the next few steps that I'm going to be using, is how we're going to create that angled line, how we're going to create the main body of this part. Okay, so probably the first thing I'm going to do is just draw a line that kind of cuts through everything. So I'm going to just start out here and draw maybe way over here and say okay. So this line is kind of slicing through the center of that circle. Now I want to reference this line. I don't want it to be an object line, so I'll click on it and say construct. And notice it turns it to a dashed, and it's kind of hard to see because it's on top of this other red line, but if I were to move that, you can kind of see it's a red dashed line. Okay, so instead of an object line, it's now a light pencil line, like a light construction line. Okay, so then I might come in here and use the offset command. So under modify, we have a really cool command called offset. In fact, we're going to use this a lot in this design. And you'll notice the shortcut for offset is the O key. So I could be out here in space and just hit O, and I'm now in my offset command. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that construction line, and you'll notice it's going to allow me to offset that line a certain distance. And in this case, according to the drawing, it's 0.302. So you'll see that I now have this line that's 0.302 from that center line. Now obviously it's too long. You'll notice it basically made a copy of it. So here's a neat little trick. I want to keep this line right here, but I don't need the rest of it over here and the rest of it over here. So I'm going to use the trim command. So I'm going to say trim. And what's cool about the trim command is you'll notice you just hover over the segment that you don't want, and you'll notice it kind of highlights it red. But if I were to trim that line right there, it would get rid of it, but then I'd have to trim this little segment right there, I'd have to trim that segment right there, and I'd have to trim that segment right there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim it as close as I can. In fact, let me just kind of zoom up so you can see what's going on here. I'm just going to trim that little segment right there. And you can see how this line now touches that circle. Now you'll notice I got a little warning that constraints or dimensions were removed during the operation, and you're going to see some pros and cons with this, right? In fact, you'll notice I don't see my offset distance anymore, but that's okay because I offset at a certain distance, and so it's in the correct location now. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm just going to go ahead and trim that little segment there. And then I can come in and just delete this big segment. So I'm just going to hit the delete key on my keyboard and select these big segments and say delete. And instead of having to delete a whole bunch of little, or trim a whole bunch of little lines, I now have something that looks like this. Okay. However, like you saw, it no longer has any constraints on it. So for example, I could grab that point and move it around, and it's no longer horizontal or anything like that. Okay, I could even grab this line right here and move it around. So you'll notice the line is blue, and I want it to be fully constrained. So I'm going to come in and constrain it with the dimension. So I'll just say from there to there, and you'll notice that it's the exact same distance. It's the 0.302. Okay, but the line is still blue, which is weird. I want to try and get it to be fully constrained. So why is it? Well, it actually has to do with this construction line. You'll notice as I move it around, I get it moving around also, but my blue line is 0.302 always away from it. So how do we fix that? Well, I'm going to constrain the construction line with that 0, 0 point, and notice what happened. Now this line can't move up or down. I can move it left or right, but I can't move it up or down. And so because we've given this a distance of a 0.302, it can't move up and down either, so it's fully constrained. Now I know that was maybe a little bit confusing, but the reason I'm pointing this out is in previous live streams we've talked about trying to fully constrain your sketch so things don't change downstream. And this was a simple example where I offset a line, but by trimming it, it kind of lost the constraints. And so I had to kind of rebuild those constraints back into there. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is start on that angled line. And according to the drawing, you can actually see there's a dimension of 2.672 from the center to where that line where the angle starts from. So I'm going to go ahead and do that to my construction line. So I'll just throw a dimension from the end point to that point there, place my dimension, and we'll type in the 2.672, and you'll see that that line grows in length. Then I can come in and I'm just going to basically just kind of draw a line. I don't really care where it goes or anything like that. I'm just going to draw a line on there. Well, I do know that it needs to be exactly, 6 degrees. So I'm going to throw a dimension in here, click on that line there, click on my horizontal construction line, and you'll notice it says like 8.63 degrees or whatever, so I could come in and say 6, and you'll see that that line updated. Okay. Then I also know that there's a line that goes from here and it touches this circle somewhere. And you'll notice as I get near that circle, it's actually creating a coincident constraint for me automatically. So I'm just going to go ahead and click, and we can kind of see that that is now touching, and there's a coincident constraint. Now, why is it blue? Well, we probably need to define a distance or an angle. So let's come in here, click that line, click that line. I'll place it, and again, according to the drawing, this is supposed to be 170 degrees. So watch what happens when I hit enter. You're going to see that this line is going to change the angle, but it's still going to touch that circle. So you can kind of see how it moved up a little bit, and that point is still right on that circle. Okay, but it's still blue. Now, why is it still blue? Well, I can move this line around just by dragging on it. I can say, oh, it's probably wanting some kind of maybe a distance or something like that. So let's dimension from the center of this circle to the point of that angled line. Let me see, I want to, according to the drawing, that is 1.6, I think. I apologize, I gotta throw my glasses on. 1.65, so I'm gonna type in, and that was pretty close, 1.65, and you can kind of see that that moved over ever so slightly, and we now have a fully constrained sketch right there. Okay, hopefully this is making sense. Now, believe it or not, I'm actually done with my sketch. I know this doesn't look exactly like what the drawing looks like, but we're keeping our sketches simple, and we're going to let Fusion do the hard work, and you'll see this here in just a moment. So I'm going to say Finish Sketch, kind of rotate it isometrically, and according to the drawing, you'll see two different thicknesses. So we've got the 0.688, kind of for the main body. We can kind of see that's the main body thickness. And then there's these little flanges or little standoffs that are 0.853. So those are the two dimensions we're going to use. Okay, so I'll come in here. I'll select my profile. So I'm going to go ahead and select all of these regions right here, like so. Right mouse click. Now I've hopefully ingrained this in your heads from previous live streams. I really like the right mouse click because it shows me the commands that make sense. I don't have to go hunting for them in a menu somewhere. So I'm going to say, well, obviously we want to extrude. And let's just go ahead and start to extrude this part. Okay. Well, this is a pretty symmetric part, so I'm going to change the direction from one side to symmetric. And you'll notice what that does is it extrudes equal distance in both directions. Now, when I say symmetric, I get this new measurement, and it's saying half length or whole length. Well, I know that the whole length is that 0.88. I'm sorry, 0.688. So I'm going to say 0.688, like so. Let me confirm that. Yep, 0.688 according to the drawing. And you'll notice that the total length is 0.688. So I use this option a lot, symmetric and whole length. I'm going to go ahead and say OK, and we now have our part. But you'll also notice something that happened. And for those of you that haven't been using Fusion for very long, this tends to freak people out. They're like, well, I added a whole bunch of information to my sketch, but my sketch got deleted. Well, no, it didn't get deleted. If I expand open my control arm component, there's my sketches, and you'll notice that it just turned off. So I could click that little eyeball, and it's going to turn my sketch back on. So by default, Fusion turns off your sketch because it assumes, okay, you used it, you really don't need it anymore, but we give you the ability to bring it back. Okay, so I'm going to turn it back on, and now I want to extrude those little flanges. But you'll notice that they're buried. My sketch is kind of buried inside my part. So I'm just going to click and hold for about a second, and you'll notice that it allows me to probe through and select different things. So for example, the very first thing is the top face. There's the profile I want, and then there's the bottom face. So I'm going to grab that profile. Same thing over here. I'm going to click and hold, grab that profile. And because this is a object line, it's kind of cutting through, it kind of split my circle in half. So I'm going to go ahead and select that profile also. So I've just selected those profiles that are stuck inside the middle of this part without having to turn parts on or off or anything like that. Okay, thanks Angelo. I just glanced, it looks like thumbs up. People are learning stuff. I appreciate that. So I'm gonna, again, right mouse click. I'll say extrude. Now watch what happens when I start to extrude. We see some red going on. And that's because Fusion is assuming since this is inside the model, you're probably wanting to cut that geometry away. And in this case, that's not true. We want to change this to join. So under this operation, it used to be cut, but we want it to join. So we're going to say join. I'm going to do symmetric again, whole length, and we know that the whole length is 0.853 according to the drawing. I'll say OK. So I reused information from my sketch that I had drawn originally and used it to help me change my design. So that's what I mentioned earlier in my drawing, where I said I really don't need this 1.6 right now, but I went ahead and drew it because it was all kind of centered on itself, and I was able to reuse that sketch. Okay, now I don't need the sketch anymore, so I'm going to just go ahead and turn it off, and we're starting to see the basic design of this part. Okay, so looking at the drawing, there are some large radiuses that go all the way around. In fact, you'll see right here it says radius 2, 4 places. So those are the kind of the main large radiuses that you see. So I'm going to do that next. So I'll go ahead and click on an edge. Right mouse click shows me the commands that make sense. I'm going to say fillet. What's the size? Well, I could type in 2 and it gives me a nice preview of what that would look like. And then I can go ahead and hold down my control key because I want to control my selection set. So I'm going to control click that line there and you'll see how it adds that nice fillet there. I'll hold down my control key, click that line there. Okay. Now I could rotate to the other side to see this particular edge, but I don't have to. I can come over here, hold down my control key, and it knows that you're wanting to select edges for fillets. So all I have to do is get kind of near where that edge is. You can see it's allowing me to pick through. So I didn't have to rotate around. And those are all radius of 2. I'll go ahead and say OK. Now it's starting to kind of look like this control arm that Angelo designed. So let's take a look at the drawing and see what the next big thing is. Well, so we've kind of got those holes, we've got those holes, we've got the arm in between. Let's start looking at this pocket that's in here, and he added this in here to kind of keep the part lightweight. So let me zoom around here real quick. So you can see we've got the pocket on the top view and we've got some pockets on the bottom view. So let's just focus on the pocket on the top view. I'm going to zoom in here. We can see that basically the wall thickness is 0.165. Okay, so we're going to learn a neat little tip here. Instead of having to recreate complex sketches, we're going to let Fusion do the work for us. So I'm going to create a new sketch on this particular face. And the reason for that is I do have, you can kind of, it's hard to see, my sketch plane is like halfway, or my origin is like halfway through the part. You can kind of see that right there. Okay. I like to think of this kind of like how it would be manufactured. So we're probably going to come in here with a cutter and machine this away. And maybe I would take measurements off of this face or something. So I'm going to create my sketch on that face. So I'm going to click on the face, right mouse click, and say create sketch. Okay. Now we're going to use that offset command again. Like I said, we're going to use it a lot. So I'm going to say offset, and it's asking for sketch curves. And you'll notice it says change selection. Watch what happens when I click on this edge. You'll see that it actually is going to offset either out or in that whole chained selection, which is really kind of cool, I think. I didn't have to select a whole bunch of edges or anything like that. Now I notice it's going in the negative direction, so I'm going to make sure I type in minus, and the thickness according to the drawing was that 0.165, and I'll say OK. And notice that this is actual geometry, and I could come in and change that distance down the road if I wanted to, be 0.1875 or something like that. I also want to offset this circle there, so I'll go ahead and say offset that circle. Now notice this time it's in the positive direction, so I could come in and say 0.165. And I now have a profile that is the exact shape as the outside of this part. Okay, so I could come in here, click on that profile, say extrude, and start to drag down, and we can kind of see that red preview kind of showing us that we're cutting into our part. Okay, so we need to, again, according to the drawing, we need to go a certain distance, and it's minus 0.275. Kind of gives me a little bit of an update what that looks like. I'll say OK. And we've now machined away or cut away that pocket. And again, going back to the drawing, here's that distance. So the section view kind of shows the depth of the pocket of being 0.275. Now looking at the drawing, I see it says radius 0.26 in 2 places. So that's going to be here and here. And this one just says a radius of 0.2, pointing to 2 places also. So 2 different size radii. So I'm going to show you a neat tip. Notice our timeline, all of the features that are appearing down here. And for this part here, we don't really have very many features so far. Well, I want to fillet this edge, so I'm going to click on it, right mouse click, and say fillet. I know that's supposed to be 0.26, and it gives me a nice preview of what that's going to look like. And I'll go ahead and control my selection and add that one in there also. And we can see what that's going to look like. Now, unfortunately, these over here are a different size. So typically, people would come in and say, okay, it would create a fillet. And then I'd have to come in here and create another fillet feature, 0.2. And let's go ahead and do that. But you'll notice I now have 2 fillet features down here. Well, here's a neat little tip. So I'm going to undo back. In fact, I'll start over. Let's just go here. I'll come in and say fillet. We'll do the 0.26. I'll grab that other edge that's right there. And then right here, you'll notice add new selection. So I'm going to go ahead and hit this little plus. And then I can come in and add that edge, and notice it creates a new line in here. And I could say that's going to be 0.20 along with that line right there. So 2 edges are 0.26, 2 edges are 0.20, and when I say OK, I only have 1 fillet feature in my timeline. But I can come back and edit this, and I could edit either of those. So it kind of helps clean up your timeline. And I like to keep things kind of organized. You know, these are the fillets for this one pocket, so let's, keep it simple. So hopefully, if you didn't know about that feature, you learned something new with that. Okay. Taking a look at the drawing, it looks like we're doing pretty good here. We've pretty much got the top of the part designed. Now let's go ahead and maybe since we just did the pocket up here, let's go ahead and do the pockets along the bottom and work on those. So again, I'm going to be using these dimensions right here. So I'm going to flip the part over, create a sketch, and once again, I'm going to offset. So I'll come in and say offset. I need to go in the negative direction, so I'm going to say minus 0.165. It creates a nice offset for me. I'll do the offset of this circle, 0.165. Okay. Now the only difference with this one is it looks like there's some supporting ribs in here. So there's actually 3 separate pockets. So I need to kind of build where these supporting ribs are at. We can see that they're 0.36 wide. So I'm going to just start building this in here. So I'll start by just drawing a couple lines. So maybe I'll go from like here to here, and I don't know, maybe something like this. I'm just kind of guesstimating right now. And notice that the lines are blue. Well, now I can come in and start dimensioning. So I know, again, according to the drawing, that this line here is, and I was pretty close, 1.7. And you'll see that that moves over a little bit and turns black. I know that this is supposed to be, let's see, go from here to here. Is supposed to be a 1.285, That moves over a little bit. And then I know the spacing of these guys are supposed to be 0.36. So here's another tip. I just typed in 0.36. I'm going to go ahead and put a dimension here. And I want it to be the same. So instead of typing in 0.36, I'm just going to click on that existing dimension. And you can kind of see it tags it. I'll say OK. And there we go. And my lines are fully constrained. And we'll finish our sketch. Now, I know some of you are probably freaking out right now because I'm doing something incorrect, right? What about this tab? Well, we're going to get back to that. And the reason I'm doing this is because this happens a lot. You know, people design their part, then they make a change to it of like, oh, let me add this, but something's wrong, okay? Now, I don't know also if you noticed when I went to click on this profile, it's also including this rib, which is not what I want. So you can see all these are like individual areas, but this doesn't seem to be an individual area. So I'm going to zoom up and take a look, and I'm going to have to get pretty close, but we can see that this isn't actually touching that line right there. And so water or whatever can spill into this other area, so that's why it's selecting it. So we can fix that really easily. I'll go back to my sketch and say extend. And it's going to be kind of hard to see. I don't know if I can get too much closer here, but you'll see that little red section. As I hover over this line, it's going to extend to that next section. And now, let me zoom way out. I can see that that's its own separate region now. So I had to kind of fix that little area right there. I'll say finish sketch. Let's select those three regions. Extrude. How far down? Well, supposedly it remembers my last options, and sure enough, there's all the things I've typed in. Well, my other pockets were 0.275, so all I have to do is click on this little down arrow and grab that minus 0.275 and say OK. And I've now created my pocket on top and my three pockets on the bottom. Now, once again, I mentioned I like to kind of keep things organized. So I'm working on these pockets. The pockets have fillets, so I'm going to go ahead and do the fillets right now instead of at the very end, for example. You totally could, but for organizational reasons, I like to kind of keep these little subsections organized. So I'm going to go ahead and do my fillets on these pockets. So I'm going to say fillet, and according to the drawing, we are, what are we at? 0.1375 for all of the pockets. So I'll type in 0.1375 and it gives me a nice preview. And I'll go ahead and select these other lines like there, there, and there. Now, notice right here, I got a weird result, not a nice smooth result. And if I hold down my control key, I can kind of see why. How this pocket was designed, there's a small edge right there. So I could go ahead and add that edge into my selection, and it basically makes a nice looking transition there. So there might be situations where you have a little tiny edge. Just go ahead and add it into your selection, and you'll notice it's actually basically getting rid of that and keeping this nice and tangential. Okay, now I could go ahead and add in all of these other lines, but what happens if maybe down the road I decide maybe this middle pocket needs a slightly different radius? So again, here's where this new selection can really kind of come into play. So I'm going to go ahead and basically add these fillets as three separate selections. Even though they're all the same size, I'm going to make it so maybe down the road I might want to change them. Okay, so you can kind of see I'm going to add those kind of as three separate selection sets, if you want to call it that, in this one fillet feature. There we go. Okay, And there's our pocket. And again, it's one fillet feature in the timeline, but we could always come back and make that 0.125 and make that middle pocket be a slightly different size. And that's kind of why I did that. You don't have to, but I'm just showing you the options that are available to you. Okay, so now I'm got my control arm. Maybe Angelo and I were talking. He's like, well, we need some way to mount this thing. And so we came up with this little tab right here. So I'm going to go ahead and draw in this tab, but you're going to see the mistake that I've made here pretty quickly. And I'll show you how we're going to go about fixing that mistake. So I can see that it's 1 inch down from the top of the part to the bottom of the tab. We can see it's kind of chamfered on the back. It's got like a 30-degree chamfer or 60-degree chamfer, depending on how you look at it. So again, I'm going to use a lot of the dimensions on here to help me design this little tab, if you want to call it that. So one of the things I'm going to do is make sure I'm looking at the bottom of the part. Okay. Actually, I mean the top of the part is what I meant to say. And I'm going to create an offset plane. So I'm going to say offset plane from that top face. I know I need to come down 1 inch. So I'm going to say -1. Okay, and that was from the drawing where the bottom of the tab is 1 inch from the top of the part. So I selected that top plane. I said offset it 1 inch. And so now we're going to be sketching kind of out in space, basically. Okay, so I'll look at the bottom, create my sketch, and once again, I'm going to just get the basic shape of what I think it's supposed to look like. Something like this. I just need a rectangle. Okay, I also need a circle that's going to be in there somewhere, so I'm just going to go ahead and draw a circle. Now here is where we can start tying things down. And you're going to see right now everything is blue. And so I want to start adding some dimensions in here. And I'm going to have to add some constraints. So for example, I want this circle to be centered in this rectangle. Okay? In fact, I'm going to drag it way over here. Now, we do have a midpoint where I could say I want that point to be in the middle of that line, but I don't want it to be on that line. And you'll notice that if I try and move that, it doesn't let me move the circle down. So how do we get this centered? Well, here's a neat little trick that my friend Jason showed me. I think this is actually a really simple solution. And hopefully you've seen some of his live streams. I'm going to go ahead and draw a line from the center of that circle. And I'm going to get near this edge right here, and you'll notice it's going to snap automatically to the midpoint. So I'm going to go ahead and click. So this line is now snapped to the midpoint and snapped to that circle. If I were to come in and tell that line to be vertical, you'll notice that that circle has to move with it. And so now our circle is exactly centered. No matter what we do to this rectangle, it's exactly centered. Now I typically change, and I think Jason does also, change that line to a construction line. And that's a really quick way of getting something centered without using the midpoint command. Okay, hopefully that was a cool tip. So I'm going to go ahead and start dimensioning this thing. So I know that the overall width, again I gotta throw my glasses on here, of this tab according to the drawing is 0.955. Okay, you see the rectangle get a little bit bigger. I know that this circle is a certain distance, 0.261. And again, I'm just pulling these dimensions off of the drawing. So instead of going back and forth, 0.325. Okay, and then I know that the overall height of this rectangle is supposed to be 1.623. Okay, now it's still fairly blue. I haven't fully constrained this thing. Even though I've kind of dimensioned it, it doesn't know where it needs to be. So using the drawing, we have some dimensions, so I can see, let me zoom up here, kind of hard to see here. The center of that circle is 0.8 inches from the center of that circle. And then, let me zoom back out here, it's 2.344 from the center of that circle. So those are the next dimensions I'm going to be focusing on. So I've got it the right size. Now I just need to position it. So I go in here to draw a dimension. I'll say from here, but when I come over here, I don't have a midpoint. I don't see a point that I can click on. So I need to project some of this three-dimensional geometry onto my sketch so I can use it. So under the Create menu, Project, you'll see this Project command. I'm going to go ahead and click on it. Click on maybe like this face or this edge, it doesn't really matter, and say OK, and you'll notice that it projected that hole. In fact, if I turn off the body, you can see that it projected that feature, that hole, and I now have a center point. So if I were to say dimension from there to there, place my dimension, and that is the 2.344 according to the drawing, and we can see how that kind of slid over a little bit. And then same thing for the height. We know that that's supposed to be 0.8, and I showed this earlier. It's trying to do a horizontal dimension. I want a vertical dimension, so I'm going to right mouse click and force it to be a vertical dimension. And now you can see my vertical dimension, and that is supposed to be the 0.8. So I'll say 0.8, and we can see it positioned it where it needed to go, and all of the lines are now fully constrained. So, quick review, I just started with a basic shape. I just drew a rectangle to kind of where I thought it was going to be, kind of drew the circle where I thought it was going to be, and then I kind of constrained everything with actual constraints and actual dimensions. So I'm done. I'm not going to fillet the corners in 2D. I'm going to keep this as simple as possible. I'll go ahead and select my profile and say extrude. Now how far do I need to extrude? Well, all I have to do is get near this face and click on it, and you'll see that it's going to snap to that face, and it's going to use that distance as necessary. And it's going to join this all together. I'll say OK, and this is still all just one body. You can see that right there because we joined it together. Hopefully you're seeing the simplicity. We're keeping things simple. Now I'll come in and fillet these edges according to the drawing, 0.35. I'll do both of those guys. I'll say OK. Now let's maybe focus on the chamfer. And now you guys are probably going, haha, look what you did. There's a pocket underneath this step that you just buried or covered up with this step. And sure enough, we did. And that was the mistake I was talking about. And like I said, this happens all the time. I know you probably don't believe it, but I make lots of mistakes in my designs. And I'm like, okay, how do I fix that? And I'm going to show you a really cool way of fixing this. Instead of undoing and starting over, we're going to keep moving forward. And at the end, we're going to fix this. So trust me on that. Okay. I want to add that 30 degrees. So I'm going to, here's another cool little tip for you all. I want to add a chamfer. Okay. And by default, it usually comes to equal distance, and it's like a 45, right? Well, I want to specify an angle. So I'm going to go ahead and say distance and angle. And what's the angle? Well, according to the drawing, it said 30, but but I can see with my preview, that's kind of going in the wrong direction. So it's the complement of that, which would be 60. And that looks much more like my drawing. Okay? And as I drag this down, we can see, sure enough, it's adding that slope. But watch what happens. It's asking for a distance. And so as I keep dragging, pretty soon it's going to error out. So I could get close, but I have no clue what the distance is going to be. And all I really cared about was that angle. So what do? Well, here's a neat trick. For the distance, I'm going to come in here and say measure. Now, how far down do I need that chamfer to go? Well, the thickness of this part. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that edge right there, and it measured the length of that edge, and it put it in for the distance. So I didn't have to guess or do measurements or anything like that. Okay? I'll say okay, and we're good to go there. Looking pretty good. Hopefully Angelo's not screaming at me. Again, he designed this part. I'm hoping I'm doing him justice. Okay, so the next thing I want to do, again, I'm kind of breaking this down into smaller chunks, is we're working on this tab, and I'm going to go ahead and maybe start doing these little knobs or whatever that are in here, maybe to add a little bit of extra support to this little step. So again, going to be using some dimensions off of here to create this. We can see that the radiuses are 0.206, and then we've also got some fillets in there. So let me go ahead and do that. So I'm going to create a sketch on this face. Now you might ask, well, couldn't you go back and use the other sketch that you used farther back, and I'd have to find it back here? So yes, I could use this sketch, but watch what happens when I edit that sketch. It's back in time. And so I don't see any of my future stuff that I've designed. So I personally like to just say, okay, I'm going to create another sketch here. So I'm going to say create sketch, and here's my sketch in time. Okay. Again, I'm just going to kind of mock up my design. I know I'm going to need a couple circles in here. I don't know. I'm going to purposely make them different sizes and different orientations just to kind of show you the power of Fusion. So what I want to do is add in some dimensions here. So I know that this guy is a radius of 0.206, but you'll notice I have a diameter. It's kind of hard to see, my cursor is kind of covering up the diameter part of it. So if I right mouse click, I can change it to a radius. And now you'll notice it's allowing me to type in a radius of 0.206. That's how quickly I forget. And I want this one to be the same. So I showed you how you could add a dimension and click on an existing dimension and it would make it the same. But notice that one did a diameter instead of a radius. So another tip is to use a constraint such as equal. I want that circle and that circle to be equal. And now they are. No matter what this changes to, 0.1, that's going to be 0.1. Okay? So that equal constraint is actually quite useful. Let me see. The other thing is I know that they need to be horizontal with each other. So I'm going to go ahead and say I want that point and that point to be horizontal with each other. And now as I move them around, you can see that they're going to stay in line with each other. And then finally, using the drawings, I can start putting some dimensions on here. So I could say I know from here to the center of the circle. And once again, I have that issue that I don't have a point to pick on. So we're going to project. So P for project. Notice it brought up the project. I'll go ahead and project that circle. If I turn off my body, you can see sure enough it projected that circle for me. now I have something to dimension to. So that project command is extremely powerful. I use it all the time. So this is supposed to be 0.721 according to the drawing. And from here to here is supposed to be 0.478 according to the drawing. You'll see it kind of move into place. And then same thing from here to here. It's supposed to be the same distance. I'm just going to click on that existing dimension, and notice my circles are black, which means they're fully constrained. I'll finish my sketch. I'll go ahead and select the profiles that I want and extrude. Now how far? I'm going to extrude down to the top of that tab. So I just clicked on the top of that tab and it figured out the correct distance for me. Okay? And it's going to join that material. So there's those little bumps. Now, according to the drawing, there's some nice fillets on there. So since I'm kind of working on these right now, I'll go ahead and add my fillets in, the 0.275 fillets. I can pick through my model. I don't even have to rotate. I'm just going to go ahead and pick those 4 edges, and we get those nice, smooth transitions. Okay. Now, for those that were really observant, I made another mistake. And if I jump back to my drawing, you'll see what it is right here. This shelf does not actually touch the bottom of the part, and I actually have a thickness that this shelf is supposed to be, or this tab, I should say. However, I told it to extrude to the bottom of the part. So I made a mistake, again, on purpose, to show you some cool functionality. Okay? So this is supposed to be 0.263, but you'll notice that it's actually 0.312. So what do? Well, lots of different options. I'd have to go back and really kind of figure out where did I create that sketch and how did I extrude it and all this kind of stuff. Or I could come in here and say, well, let's just go ahead and push this face down. So I'm going to do a press pull, and I want to basically shorten the height of this little tab. But watch what happens when I start to drag. You'll notice it gives me a preview, but then it like separates and I get an error and all that kind of stuff. And it doesn't look like this is going to be an option or a solution for us, which is kind of a bummer. Well, here is what it's trying to do. It's trying to do an automatic offset. It's trying to update everything that it's touching. Well, if I come in here and say new offset, watch what happens. I can pull this face down and you'll notice it's actually lengthening these little fillets here. It didn't mess with anything back there. We're basically saying we want to move this face a new distance. Well, how far do we need to go? Well, there's some math for you, but I hate math. I'm going to let Fusion do it for me. And I've shown this in previous live streams, but I love this command, and it's called the re-anchor command. What this is telling me right now is I've moved it 0.157 from where it used to be, which was kind of up here. I've moved it 0.157 down. If I say re-anchor and I click this bottom face, I can now specify the distance from this bottom face. In fact, you can kind of see that black arrow right there. So now I can come in and say, I want this thickness to be 0.263, and you can see how it updated. I'll say OK. I click on that edge, and it tells me it's 0.263. I know that was a lot of information there, but I basically started offsetting this face. I told it measure from the bottom and make it 0.263 for the distance. And I fixed that particular issue without having to edit extrudes or change sketches or anything like that. And you'll notice that it actually shows up as an offset feature. Okay, I know we're at the top of the hour. I'm going to go just a few minutes over. I want to show how we're going to fix this buried pocket thing. And the reason, again, kind of a quick review, the reason that happened was because I did these pockets first, and then I did this little tab, and it basically covered it up. So what if we could move the pockets to be created after the tab was created? And so this is where I'm going to mess with my timeline. So first thing I'm going to do is I need to figure out which of these extrudes created the pockets. Okay, so I'm going to click on, for example, that face right there, and you'll notice these three little dots or the little dashes that appeared over this extrude. So that's telling me, and I could click any of these faces, that's telling me that's when that extrude was created. If I click on that one, it tells me that's when that extrude was created. It's a neat little tip. So I just click on a face, and I know that that was the extrude that was used. So if that was the extrude that was used, I pretty much know that that was my sketch that I used to create. That is my extrude. And then I did my fillets. And remember, I did my fillets as one fillet feature, even though there's 3 different ones in there. If I had done them separately, I'd want to select all 3 of my fillet features. But basically what I'm doing here is I'm selecting the sketch that created the pocket, I'm selecting the extrude that created the pocket, and I'm selecting the fillets that are created with that pocket. I'm just going to drag these guys to the end. So notice this little icon right here, okay? As I drop it, you'll see it's now there. And that's because I moved the sketch, the extrude, and the fillet to the end of the timeline. So they're not back here anymore, they're now here at the end. Hopefully that made sense. I just took those 3 features where they were and I drug them to the end of my timeline. Now you're like, well, hey, it didn't fix the pocket. No, that's because we extruded down only. But check this out. I can come in here and say edit feature. And instead of extruding only one side, let's extrude 2 sides. And as I start to drag up, you're going to see it's going to start machining up. How far? All I have to do is click on the bottom of my tab there. I'll say OK and check out my pocket. Everything is fixed. Everything works. So I basically took something that I did back in time and I moved it to the end of time and then modified it slightly. Okay. So somebody said, couldn't you have just extruded up from that face? Absolutely. But what I wanted to show here is how you can actually rearrange your timeline, if need be, to fix potential issues like this. Now, let me undo to answer that question. So I'm going to go put those things back. So now they're back in time. I'll click on that extrude. Okay, so that's this extrude here. And I'm going to go ahead and say edit feature. But notice what happened to my tab. It hasn't happened in time yet, so I don't know how far I need to extrude in this direction. And if I say OK, notice it didn't do anything because this tab was not created during that extrude. And I know this can get kind of confusing. It's kind of like Back to the Future and all that kind of stuff. So unfortunately, just editing that extrude did not fix the problem. Okay, so that's why I ended up having to do the move these 3 guys to the end. Now they're after the tab was all created. I can edit that feature, change it to the 2 sides, and drag up. So yeah, great question. Thanks for asking that. Ron, I liked your comment. That's pretty funny. Ron's like, I wish you could modify my timeline. Okay, so anyways, here we are. So probably the last thing I'm going to do is I want Angelo to manufacture this out of aluminum. So I'm going to come in here and change the physical material. So I'm going to say physical material. And this is going to allow me to specify what is this made out of. Ceramic, glass, metals, and I can see all the different kinds of aluminum. So I'm going to scroll down. I think he probably wants to use like aluminum 6061 T6, I think is what he has in the shop. So I'm just going to go ahead and drag and drop that onto my part, and you can see that it kind of changed the look of it a little bit. Now, why would I do something like that? Well, I can come in here, right mouse click, and say properties. And it's going to tell me how much it's going to weigh. It's going to tell me where the moment of inertia is and the center of mass and all that kind of stuff, etc. So it allows me to figure out how much is this thing going to weigh. I could run some simulations on this to verify that is this going to be strong enough, etc. Okay, so sometimes I'll add the material to it. That way I know more about the part. So I'm going to save it. I'll call this ready for manufacture. Now I want to share this with Angelo. So I'm going to open my data panel here, and here's my control arm. Now I don't want to, you can see I've done a bunch of them. I don't want to share everything in my project with them. I just want to share this control arm. So I'm going to come in here, right mouse click, and say share public link. And what this is going to allow me to do is it brings up this dialog box, and you'll see it says share the latest version with anyone using this public link. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn this on, and it's going to create this public link. Now don't copy this, don't use it, because I'm actually going to change it because I don't want everybody to have access to this model, so don't try that. Anyways, I would say copy, and I would give this to Angelo. I could send it to him via chat or an email or whatever, and he now has access to just this particular part, okay, in my design. He doesn't have access to all the other stuff. So I'm going to do that outside of this live stream, but that's how I would share this part with my manufacturer. So, okay, I know I went a few minutes over. Hopefully this was beneficial to you. We wanted to take it kind of to the next level. The last one we did was the spark plug. It was pretty simple, you know, kind of mostly just turning. This one is going to be a little bit more challenging for Angelo. He's going to have to do dual setups to machine this part. And so make sure you tune in next week, where Angelo is going to show how he would actually add the tool paths, how he would do the setups, maybe how he would mount it to the machine, etc. Like I said, Angelo is awesome with the manufacturing side of things. So make sure you tune in. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Make sure you, if you have any comments, throw them into the comments field in the YouTube video. And the drawing for this control arm is in the description. So if you want to attempt this yourself, give it a go. Because remember, with Fusion 360, you can make anything. Thank you.